planned this conversation, I didn't imagine I'd start this conversation by the Star Trek quote, boldly going where no people have gone before. You're those people. Trying to have this conversation on data after a good lunch session. So stay with me. I'll try to make it as interesting as I can through the 67 slides that I have. And I'll make it quick, but I'll give you some time for Q&A. A quick works. A quick note about me. I have had the distinct pleasure of sitting both on the consulting agency side as well as the brand side. For the last 23 years, it's almost an even split. And I've been doing this for a long time, and that's why I am humbled to be here, to talk to a lot of experts about practical use of analytics and data, right? We do, where they created a data utilization index. For all of you who use indexes, a value of 100 is basically that implies that you're neither over-indexed nor under-indexed. Do you know what the overall data utilization index score for US brands, agencies, everybody was collectively? Any guesses? 50%, 50.1. The small businesses were at 48.8 and large businesses were at 53.2. So even dispel the notion that large organizations know how to extract value from data. This is not me. There's a bunch of sources. Only 4% of our organizations fall in the category of information elite. 36% uninformed, ill-equipped. 40% are aware, but they don't use it. So really, that sets up, when we talk about managing our own ID spaces, activating based on a DMP, taking that technology forward, connecting the data pieces together, what can be done by disconnected, high-volume, high-velocity, unstructured data versus what can be done with structured data, we ought to think about this. We're sitting on a lot of data. And here's the paradox. Marketers also tell us, yet again, a lot of research will tell you that there is a growing need for that. That number has stayed constant for almost 2 years. We talk about cross-channel, cross-device, marketers basically telling us as much as 80, 82, 83% of the, depending on which research report you look at, high numbers, they tell us this is what they plan to use for cross-device activation, audience profiling, cross-channel activation. But as much as 80% of those marketers are also telling us that we are under-optimized and we need to use the holistic setup to drive value. So why does this happen? Why are we not able to extract value from data, right? And the reason I chose this topic to discuss with you is forums like this allow us to come together to the table, literally across the table, and see what value we can drive from data. Because we're all facing the problem of, can we drive incremental ROI? Can we bring CPMs down? Can we bring down cost per acquisition? Can we drive more conversion? And if we keep just looking at one aspect of the problem, the clients on the other side, the brands on the other side are not going to get this value. And so we ought to utilize what we have while we keep adding to the portfolio. Make sense? Everybody still awake? Just checking. Just checking. Why does this happen? I'll run through this quickly. In my assessment, there's 3 major reasons why that is happening. Organizational factors. Anybody ever heard a priority from their client, or for those of you who work with different brands, saying, extracting value from data is my top priority? Show of hands? Okay, didn't think so. There's obviously the funding issue. I'm not going to go there. How much goes into test and learn? Let me talk a little bit about culture. The culture of heuristics, the culture of I know how to do this versus the culture of learning, right? Those are also impediments. Talent, it's a whole topic of discussion. People like me and many of you travel a long way from planet Tatooine to planet Earth, so we're few and far between. Difficult to find people who understand how to use the data in a practical way. Also, what doesn't work is when you go out and get that talent, create small pools, 1 or 2 or 3 people trying to make sense out of all of this with data sciences. You have to create an ecosystem where they thrive and flourish. Data and technology factors. How many examples here of people who know that their CTOs, their CMOs, and their COOs actively sit down and share data and talk about what pieces of information they have? Show of hands again. Awesome. Hats off to you. You're one of the few people who've seen that. Oftentimes, you'll see marketing stack not talking to the enterprise stack, not talking to other data that may be collected in other pieces of the business, whether it's credit worthiness, returns, sales, customer satisfaction data, all lives in silos, right? So when we talk about ID space or what we can manage together, we ought to also think about there are pieces of information that won't necessarily be tied together day one, but it has a practical use for it. Obviously, in there, we talked about security of data, old infrastructure. Obviously, we don't need to elaborate on that. Everybody in this room is very familiar, is a technology expert, missing tech stack components. But I did talk about data science. Mark, where are you from the previous panel session? Did he leave already? I didn't pay him. I didn't give him $20 to say this. He doesn't know this yet, but he's on my BFF list already. When he said that solving for analytics requires data, technology, and data sciences. How many organizations do we know who have invested time, energy, and people into creating a robust data science practice? There you go. There you go. Awesome. I love you already. Very few, though. Very few. So that is, again, one of the reasons why we can't extract value from data. And then, obviously, process factors like focusing on outcomes versus focusing on a solution. Those things come in play. So what do we... What is the fix? The fix is not a method, a tech component, an analysis, or a missing source of data. The fix is, we put this across for all of our clients, a systems approach to extracting value from data. It'll only happen if people in this room go out and make it happen. So we've got to find ways to doing that. And I'll explain what I mean by systems approach to extracting value from data in a second. I won't go into all these details, but as you create a systems approach to extracting value from data, there are a few things that you must think about. Data centralization, democratization of data, often talked about, but I'm talking much, much larger than just tying cookies and device IDs or different forms of user-level information with some ID and create an ID space. I'm talking much larger than that. You need to be able to look at all of the data, centralize it, so many, if not all, decisions can be made from it. Governance, again, time and effort must be spent in trying to make sure that these pieces are tying together. Somebody has to stay on top of things. What is the new source of data? This is all talking about data that you may have. Because unless you get a good idea of what you have, it's not going to be very effective to go out and say, this is what I further want to improve. And the last thing, AI, neural net, almost essential, some form of automation. No, we're not building Skynet. It's not going to take over the world. People are not going to die. But some form of automation is absolutely necessary to bring that efficiency. With me so far? OK, let's go into the systems approach that I talked about. Some of this is going to be obvious to you. It's the lower part where you may see the connection between a practical application of extracting value. Organizational charter, you start with what the organization goals are. We all go through this thing. I'm not talking about large goals or what have you. I'm just talking about marketing, people-based marketing. Goal might be to increase sales by so many %, reduce cost per acquisition by so and so %. A systems approach to solving for data extraction, extraction of value from data is going to identify those, because once you do that, you can break it down by sub-initiatives. If your goal is to increase sales or decrease cost per acquisition by 10%, Well, where is that 10% going to come from? Maybe 20% of that 10% comes from reducing CPMs. X% comes from doing something else. Because once you map that out, that's when you have the opportunity to say, is this a data gap? Is this a technology gap? Or is this an analysis gap? We talk a lot about if there is a data gap, there's many things that you could do, ID mapping being only one of them. If there is an analysis gap on the right-hand side, which I find in a lot of clients, that's where you got to start building up data science application pieces to it. What do you do if, so let me go to the next slide, it might be easier to understand. And then obviously the last piece is, once you mapped all this out, is the brand itself or the agency itself able to do all of those things? There has to be a division of labor, right? Not everything identified on this can be done at the same level by everybody. And if you do, you're in that 4% that I showed you, information elite. Most of us don't live there. So it gives you some form of templated way to understand what my data gaps are, what my technology gaps are, and what data sciences will I need to solve for this. That's when you start creating a data inventory. Much of what you will see as data sources here will be familiar to you. You or part of your team have all worked with different forms of log files, be it double-click logs, search, social, programmatic, online video, whatever the case may be, right? You may have trade desk log files. You may have different forms of data for your paid media. You will probably have organic data. I was briefly talking about all the pieces of enterprise data that you have, not just CRM. And then there may be third-party data pieces. This is really, so the way I'm building this up, as if you can see, is because you did a systems approach to mapping out where your data needs were, it's much easier to figure out what my gaps are for filling those holes. Once you have that, there's data that you can stitch together. You could use an onboarder, you could store it in the cloud, you can use it DMP, and then there's going to be information, there's going to be data pieces that are not going to be stitched together, right? Why is that important? Because even if you activate on a universal ID and are able to distinctly identify a person and serve the right message at the right time, there's still going to be false positives, right? And by false positives, I don't mean a medical testing kit. I mean type 1 and type 3 errors in the world of stat. Statistically, this top part is going to help you identify when your deterministic models generate error. I was traveling with my wife for a conference she was attending, and I'm not making this up. Her phone died, we were in the car, and she used my phone, and she was browsing. She was trying to shop something. And since then, my Facebook carousel has been sending me ads for women's shoes and Van Gogh ties. I love Van Gogh ties, she loves shoes, don't get any ideas in terms of what I'm buying, but that's two different people conducting a search on a same device. That's a type 3 error. And that's fixable. It is not going to be fixable by simply looking at the device ID or the user ID and say, this is what the error is. In order to ascertain that, you'll have to go to the top part. What additional descriptors do you have? What probability models have you built in place that when an anomaly happens in a certain behavior, you're able to map that anomaly and improve your predictability in the model that you're using. Does that make sense? So my main point here is, if you start with the business outcomes first and you have a robust data science practice or partner to go along with the tech and data components that you have, even your deterministic models are going to work better. Let alone things that today cannot be done deterministically. Make sense? Anybody keeping count on how many times I said deterministic in that last sentence? Was that Todd? Oh, was it you? Oh, perfect. I'll go with the number. I'll go with the number. I love numbers, right? So where does this lead us? Once you've done that, let me see how I'm doing on time. Perfect. I'll quickly wrap this up. Now comes the application part. You can map out a customer journey a lot better. You can understand the different motivations. Brian from Spotify was talking about different moments of people listening to different kinds of music. Those are different intents that it can trigger. You're much better, much more equipped to take a customer journey, undertake a customer journey analysis when you have those data pieces together. We've talked ad nauseum about this, right? I'll just give you an example. People-based marketing is beyond ad serving, in my humble opinion. Yet again, I'm not making this up. When I went and applied for my PhD, I filled out the form. I applied. My application was sent out, and then the enrollment advisor at the university called me, and they said, "We're just verifying your information. You've submitted all the required documents, transcripts, everything." So I said, "Fine, let's verify it." First question, do you have a high school diploma? And I'm like, "No, I just woke up, didn't even graduate 5th grade. I just decided to leapfrog after 5th grade and go do my PhD." I mean, you see what I'm trying to say? People-based marketing isn't just ad serving. They have every piece of data about me. There are conjoint models that can be built, that can be deployed to call centers, that can be deployed to content, much, much beyond ad serving. We have that data. We're sitting on it. So those are the kind of situations which are easy fixes that should never happen. I already leaned into content. The thematic of extracting content, particularly as we are going into the age of voice search, and your search is going to become very conversational. It's not going to be 4 keywords or 2 keywords or 10 keywords. It's going to become very conversational. So you're going to need machine learning. You're going to need a neural net. You're going to need some form of a method to extract context out of it. And your content engines probably will start interfacing with those models. So yet again, this only works if you have a robust set of data that you're utilizing collectively. Last one, very obvious one. Each of that collective set of data, the combinations, applies to the different stages of the pyramid. When do you have a conversation? How do you support brand marketing? How do you support a particular hyper-targeted segment, whatever you want to call it, right? So that's a very obvious one. But again, keeping track of the time. Last thing I will leave you with, this is my 67th slide that I mentioned, right? If we are here together as a group, talking about extracting value from data in this forum. We've talked about people-based marketing. Let's extend the conversation on are we extracting value from data to a few other things. These are just nibbles I'll leave you with. Can you use that for dynamic pricing? Can you use that for offers and promotions, right? Right place, right time. Why not use it? Cross-channel automation. I already mentioned about this. Call center conversions. These are some topics, customer service and demand estimation. So these are some topics that I'll leave you with, that as a part of this is awesome that all practices have come together to talk about the use of data. And if I can plant that seed and we leave this meeting with our discussion extended to other forms of using that collated data, that's a step forward for all of us. So with that, thank you for giving me the time.
Terrific. Thank you, Dr. Ram, for opening us off here today at the Data Forum. As you're thinking about questions you might ask him, I'd like to invite everyone in the back to take some of these open seats up here in front. There's actually, well, probably not a seat for everyone, but there's a good number of seats. So please do try to find a seat. Any questions for Dr. Ram? Got it all? Got one? Jeff? Was that you? Oh, you weren't raising your hand. I'm sorry. Okay. Question over here. Just please tell us who you are and where you work. Thank you.
Michael Koshansky, Havas-Helia. Quick question. So our CEO of Havas US, he kind of put this thing out there. He said, prove to me that this level of personalized marketing delivers enough economic value to offset all of the magic that you're doing with data and systems and hiring teams of 80 data scientists and stuff like that. He's like, if I lose a little bit of margin, I at least don't have to invest millions of dollars and rip my hair out to create this sort of ecosystem. So how do I prove out that value, and how do I deliver that to some of my skeptical advertisers?
Are you trying to do it by yourself, or are you trying to do it on behalf of your clients? I'm guessing latter, right?
Latter.
Yeah. And the reason I ask that question is it eventually comes down to investing in resource, time, or what have you. But we do, so I'll answer that question from the perspective of what we do, right? We have a sandbox that we created in our practice. And our analysts, data scientists are constantly experimenting new ways of delivering incrementality, right? So everybody in the room probably is very familiar with, I'll just use programmatic since that's been our conversation, right? Very familiar with placebo testing, right? Placebo testing will give you an idea of how much incremental lift that you're getting through programmatic, right? But that's where the buck stops in many cases. We had to go through many iterations for all of our different clients, particularly one client who was here in the morning earlier. We did this work for them as well. My point here is that in the sandbox, we're constantly experimenting new things. So once we did an incrementality test, we did the placebo test, we figured out what the lift was. That is not a true economic value. Because I could make the argument saying some of that incrementality would be there even if you run a standard display campaign, right? So then we started creating tests and controls. And we really figured out of that incrementality which was due to the tactic. And then multiply that by the conversion, whatever the case may be, to put a value to what incrementality means, and then how much investment of time, resources is required. The thing that worked in our favor is right from the get-go, again, goes back to our genesis. We've been part of DoubleClick and Google. We learned this long time ago that it is always good to have a small practice, like a sandbox I was talking about, that can continuously do this. Because we had that there, we were able to ascertain what is the true incrementality there, and does it warrant the cost offset that we'll be presenting to the client, which is why I asked the question earlier, are you doing it yourself or are you doing it for the client? So now the client actually sees, and in some cases it's actually good to take it back to the client, look, this is not going to work for you. And that's perfectly fine as well. Am I answering your question?
Take maybe one more question if there are any. If not, well, you do have one now? All right, go for it.
You mentioned universal ID. I know that there was an opinion earlier on another panel, that maybe that's not a good idea, maybe it is a good idea. Seems like it would make your life a lot easier. There's still we're still living in a cookie-based world when it comes to attribution. Most attribution companies are still focused on that, even to the point where they'll tell people to optimize out of channels where their attribution model doesn't work.
Correct.
So like an email.
Correct.
So doesn't the universal ID make your life a heck of a lot easier? Or what are you thinking about the universal ID?
Yes and no. I'll say yes and no because clearly from the obvious use cases that you're talking about, it definitely makes your life easier. So for example, bear with me for a second. This is where you take out your pitchfork and throw it at me. If you're using something like a Markov chain breakoff model, that has to have a chain of data. That's what typically Adometry or any other providers will use. In that case, a universal ID or something like this will be awesome because you have a path or a chain that you can study. What happens when you throw disconnected data at it? There's a lot of work that we do on offline attribution, right? You cannot use things like a Markov chain. You have to build simulation models. You have to build Bayesian models. So in those cases, whether or not I have a universal identifier doesn't really help me because I'm going to go straight to the source. I'm going to pick up the impressions from search, impressions from display, whatever the raw data is, because there is no chain to tie that together. short way of answering that question is we like to stay on trend, but we recognize what its potential is at the given time. If you're trying to use a universal identifier as a solution to everything and the industry is not there yet, just as a general rule of thumb, your costs are going to overrun the benefit that you're going to get from a situation. Am I answering your question?
Okay, I think we're out of time. Dr. Om, thanks so much.
Thank you.
Okay, I'd like to invite our first panel of the afternoon to start taking the stage.